Welcome, and thank you for being here with us today. My name is Stephanie LaRue. I am the acting director at CSREA, the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America. CSREA is an interdisciplinary hub that aims to build community with the public and among scholars and students working on race and ethnicity in and around the United States. Today's event, entitled Being La Dominicana, Race and Identity in Visual Culture of Santo Domingo, is a book talk by Dr. Rachel Afi Quinn. Rachel Afi Quinn is an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Cultural Studies and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at the University of Houston. She holds a PhD in the program in American Culture at the University of Michigan and a BA in African American Studies from Wesleyan University. Her transnational feminist cultural studies scholarship focuses on mixed race gender and sexuality, Black feminist biography, and visual culture in the African diaspora. In 2015, she was part of the team that produced the documentary film Cimarron Spirit. Her writing on race and culture has been published in The Black Scholar, Small Acts, Latin American and Latinx Visual Culture, Meridians, and Burlington Contemporary. Her first book, Being La Dominicana, Race and Identity in the Visual Culture of Santo Domingo, was published in 2021 by University of Illinois Press. Tonight's program will involve our guest speaking for about 30 minutes, and the remaining time of the hour will be left for discussion. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Professor Quinn. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, let me just pull up my slides as well. I want to thank you so much for inviting me to be here and share my first book. I'm just going to sort of do an overview, have this handful of slides to share what I have been working on, and then I really look forward to a conversation, and we'll see if audience members have some questions for me about this project. It's really something to have spent a decade on this work and then get to realize it in this way. And, you know, it came out during the pandemic last year in 2021. And so I'm just getting to see how folks are responding to the work, mostly through Zoom conversations. And now more and more people have the book in their hands, are letting me know their thoughts on this project. And as an object, the book really captures so much. Just the cover work is by my friend Lucia Mendez, and I was thrilled to have her participate in the project in this way and get her work represented. And throughout the book, there are a lot of artists that I have built these relationships with over my time spent in Santo Domingo. I first went to Santo Domingo in 2006 to explore whether I might be able to study race and mixed race in that context and who I could have these conversations with. And then I lived there in 2010 for over a year. And then I was returning to the Dominican Republic for every few years until most recently, and during the pandemic, I was away for almost 3.5 years, but then had an opportunity to present this book. So today there's so much happening in this text that a cultural studies text in which I try to give a sense of the context of Santo Domingo and the cultural productions by particularly Dominican women and how they're navigating producing identity within the context of the Caribbean and also within the transnational flows of media and popular culture. But I'll start with just kind of, as I do with the book, this metaphor of la muñeca sin rostro, which really is a souvenir, a doll that you can find in most stores throughout, especially in tourist zones of Santo Domingo. But, it's both embraced by tourists, visitors to the island, and also Dominicans carry this, have this in their home or carry it into the diaspora. But the muñeca sin rostro, or doll without a face, if you ask people, they'll say, well, it's because there's no one set of features that, because Dominicans are so mixed, there's no one way to kind of visualize this identity. And they're mixed in terms of European and of African descent, and also indigenous people. And so there's this constant contention around, Dominican racial identity and the narratives of that. And that is part of what brought me to the project, but I found many more things on my journey. I was interested in studying the Dominican Republic because of my own racially mixed background and my, embodied understanding that as someone with a Ghanaian and West African father and a Jewish, white Jewish mother, depending on the context I was in, I was being racialized differently. So in Ghana, I'm white. In the US, where I grew up, I was mostly around whiteness, but identified as Black. And so just that experience drove the questions I had that I brought to this project. And I thought, although I'm not Dominican, that I might be able to get some ideas and answers and theories from the community in Santo Domingo, and understanding that the Dominican Republic is like predominantly mixed race of African descent. So I took this metaphor of La Muñeca Sin Rostro and ran with it. And throughout the book project, I used a lot of sometimes objects, symbols, images, in a process of kind of decoding their meaning and thinking like with the tools of cultural studies. So that was very exciting to me. The other thing I do with the project is, of course, ask people questions. So I always try to remind people I'm not an anthropologist, but in fact, I am the daughter of an anthropologist, my late mother, Naomi R. Quinn. I was always exposed to an interest in people and culture. And so I took asking Dominican women very seriously in my project, but I learned that if I was going to talk about race and racial ambiguity, that I needed to use visual images. So here on this slide, you have the exact example of the printout that I brought to my interviews with some almost 40 Dominican women. Some were follow-up interviews, so maybe the first half, about 30, I brought this piece of paper so that we could have a conversation about visual representation of gender and race, and I could discern whether or not we were seeing the same things and what kinds of ideas about race and gender people were bringing to their viewing of these representations. So what you see here in the square, the top row is Zoe Saldana, who you might recognize, and then Marta Heredia, who won the American Idol 2010, I want to say. And then at the bottom corner, a smaller image of Rita Indiana Hernandez, who was really actively performing in Santo Domingo in 2010 while I was there. And then Michelle Rodriguez, who was in all of the Fast and Furious films, and people knew her in that context, but then she turns up to play Minerva Mirabal in a Dominican film because she's also Dominican. So I took this collection of Dominican women into the conversation and then would ask questions like, who do you see as most Dominican and why? What are the signifiers? And I thought that I found some interesting things, especially when at the time, Zoe Saldana's image was all over the city in perfume ads, on billboards and things, but she wasn't necessarily who people saw as most Dominican. And at that time too, in the US, people were just barely understanding her as a Dominican because all of her roles were African American. So what people negotiate when they come to the image is this narratives that they have. And so I had actually used Zoe Saldana as a space in another article that I wrote, a space to kind of theorize what stories we tell about identity. But then and how looking is shaped by those stories. But then what was also interesting in my conversations with Dominican women was hearing about class signifiers that they saw on Marta Heredia, for example, and saw her as Dominican York. And then Rita Indiana and her light skin or Dominican whiteness, and how still, because of the music that we were hearing all the time in 2010 of her, that she was identified as very authentically Dominican, because of the language that she uses. So none of the things that we would necessarily see in the image, but people brought it to their reading of the image and our discussion. And then as that was a starting point for this book project, or at the time, the dissertation. And then as I spent time in the DR, I came to and then coming and going from the island, I started to see the cultural, like the visual images that Dominican women were producing. And so this image produced by Penelope Collado, who's in the image, and circulated on her social media, really stood out to me because I read it in the text. I show the ways that, obviously Penelope has an idea in her head about like the stereotypes of the Caribbean, because she's producing this photograph that counters the kind of romantic images we have of not only the beauty of the Caribbean, and here she's staged this photograph is in front of the overflowing trash cans, also ubiquitous in Santo Domingo, but she is like understanding her body in this, in green hair and resisting the narrative. So she posts this image with hashtag Santo Domingo Paradise on her social media and gets a lot of response from other folks. So I enter into a media discourse in which Dominican women have these critiques of how their bodies are being represented and commodified in that context. So that particularly interested me in how I wanted to tell the story in this project, and looking at agency and resistance in images. And I think my book, enters or brings the next wave of Dominican studies with also this kind of demand that we engage with the visual, right? Since the visual is part of what produces our ideas of the Caribbean. And at the time, my work is on Facebook, because that's what was so popular and engaged at that moment. And then I sort of lived through this shift to Instagram, especially amongst all of these artists and the multi-platform use. But I felt like I really needed to pay attention to this media. It's interesting because I felt like maybe I was neglecting telenovelas, which are another like big part of the culture, and of course in Latin America and the Caribbean, although at the time, like Dominicans weren't producing telenovelas, they were consuming them. So in this instance, it's like, what were people starting to produce on Facebook and in the popular culture? And so I just wanted to share kind of the, table of contents of what's in this book, because my experience is kind of a lengthy text, and I'm doing a lot of different things. And maybe in the end, as a first book, it turned out a little differently than I thought it would. I had been trying to focus my attention to Afro-Dominican identities. And then in this final project, I actually ended up writing a lot about Dominican whiteness, because it was a space, like people who either I saw as white, or they moved through the context of the Dominican Republic with some privileges of whiteness. And it was because of that ambiguity, they were able to mobilize different powers and privileges. So there's like two central chapters that really look at that. And then there's a theme of whiteness throughout. And in the process of producing this book, I was able to develop a few different theories about how race and mixed race were working. But one of the ways that I look at and think about racial ambiguity is by using Black women's writing as theory. And I use Nella Larson's Passing novel and how she offers us these moments of interaction that get at that awkward moment of ambiguity where one's trying to identify someone else racially. So I take that as a tool of theory, and then I kind of develop my own concept of the seesaw, that in any moment you can you're moving against this relational identity that might lift one person's identity above another. And I think that I do that in part because my training in feminist theory, specifically transnational feminist theory, I'm like very attuned to dynamics of power. And so I'm thinking about that in the moment? How do I analyze the power dynamics that are at play? And why is it important to think, within and beyond the context of Santo Domingo? Because the lives of the women that I interviewed, and they were predominantly, like working class, middle class folks who had access to education, their lives were very transnational lives. And it was very common that they would be familiar with Rita Indiana Hernandez, who's now, quite an award-winning writer, but incredible cultural producer of the Dominican Republic, I think representative of the kinds of cultural productions that are going on there. So if you're not familiar with her work, I would encourage you to look up her music videos, look up her writing. My focus in my work was to really pay close attention to the visual works that she was producing, because there's an impressive amount of visual culture that comes out of the Dominican Republic. And some of that has to do with the art schools, the level and quality of work and what people have access to producing. And as I've been, exploring that, I've also seen it has to do with the kinds of degrees that people are able to get, the influence of advertising and marketing, and just the neoliberal context. But what I found in my project of looking even more closely across all of the kinds of art was that it was helpful to also look at surrealism as, influencing the kinds of work that people are making. And actually, so this still from La Hora de Volver, you kind of see this surrealist art within this text, but you can see it across a lot of the influences and what people are embracing in the Dominican Republic these days around popular culture, and why certain themes might continue to resonate. And so we have Rita Indiana and how she performs race and gender in her works as a queer Dominican who, with a very particular masculine phenotype that and light skin, and what's possible for her to mobilize as an artist. And then in my chapter on Rita, I also, question the ways that she takes on and even perhaps appropriates, culture from Haitian practices, and question why she might feel compelled to darken her skin for her performance in Da Balados in that music video. And I found from 2010, there's just so much media circulating of these performances and videos at YouTube as an archive. So I think a lot about what the digital archives have to offer us in terms of, as scholars, in terms of writing about context, and it's able to sort of stay connected to what was going on the island in Santo Domingo while, abroad, and kind of make visits like so many Dominicans do, make visits to the island, engage with popular culture, also keep connected from the diaspora. This is an example of Facebook in an earlier iteration and the ways that it works as a visual archive. And in this case, particularly archiving a production of La Casa de Bernarda Alba, another sort of Spanish surrealist text that was produced and has continued to be produced over the years, but was a production of it from 2013 that I write about. And with that production, I was very interested in what happens if you put Caribbean women's bodies into this text, because color is informing how we understand the relations amongst women. And so I had the opportunity to interview the director, Isabel Spencer, and some of the members of this iteration of the group, and hear what they had to say about Afro-Caribeña identity and how they thought about themselves in terms of race. And that allowed me, so the conversations with them allowed me a closer reading of the particular performance. And then I was also able to look at, how scholars of the text have analyzed the meanings within it. And I discovered in the process that Federico Garcia Lorca was, very interested in the visual, the photographic and also whiteness being a theme throughout the story of the play. So there's some very interesting moments in that narrative of how the actresses engage these themes that resonate beyond the text and in the contemporary moment. I don't know if I'm going too fast, but let's see. So I'm covering a lot of the things that I hope to share, and I wanted to, let me stop for a moment and just read. There was, in studying, like in encountering these ways that whiteness emerges in the text, there's always, for me, kind of awkward moments where I'm awkwardly trying to take my framework of analysis for race into a conversation with an interlocutor, we would say. Sometimes folks I didn't know at all. Sometimes folks in my community and network, or particularly queer activist network that I knew from, hanging out at Parque Duarte, where artists would and do spend time in Santo Domingo. And sometimes I had community that I would connect with in the neighborhood I was living in outside of the center, and people would refer folks to me to have conversations. And it's interesting because I was aware of the power dynamics of our relationships, and me coming in as this outside researcher, which was not so foreign in Santo Domingo. People are kind of used to that. But as I interviewed people, and later we would connect online, and then our relationship, maybe our friendship, would continue over the last decade. So when I go back, I have opportunities to reconnect with folks, and they would talk to me about how they experienced being interviewed. Sometimes they themselves, had their own art and writing and things that they were producing that I could collaborate with them about or on, which really interests me. But it was powerful to see kind of like what are the limits of trying not to create a very extractive project of research, but figuring out like how I might, what are the connections, how I might be a part of a transnational community, what are my responsibilities to the community I'm a part of, and then also where are these difficult moments where we're trying to talk across big ideological differences. And so I had pulled this one passage I wanted to share because for me it was a challenging moment in the process of interviewing. These are the youngest people I interviewed, I think 18 and 19 years old, and there were two friends. And occasionally I did joint interviews, which went much more smoothly, I think, because people sort of had this comfort level. So I experimented with that. But in this case, what gets revealed are the ways, like in this conversation, where until asked, you maybe don't know that your friend has certain perceptions of you. And so I wanted to share that, and we can maybe discuss. So it's in the middle of the book on page 137, and the two friends are Amber and Jessica, and you can, I think, see the differences between them and their childhood friends. So they just grew up in the same neighborhood and always spent time with each other, but they're headed on different trajectories. And so let's see what you think of this scene. When Amber confidently shares her views about race and gender, they echo underlying rhetoric regarding social identity constructions pervasive in many circles in the Dominican Republic, both educated and undereducated. Her racial privilege reveals itself. There are many women who are tough. There are women who are weak, Amber explains matter-of-factly. This also depends on race, she says. In the Dominican Republic, the meaning of the term raza, which typically translates into English as race, is further blurred by our conversation when Amber goes on to describe these tough women while connecting the term raza with rústica, and yet another term. She says, hay una raza rústica como fuerte, molleta, fuerte, meaning there's a less refined race of people. She uses the term fuerte to mean strong, but by adding the term molleta, she's also referring to color. Molleta is a Dominican term that describes a woman who's both brawny and morena, or dark brown in color. I had not heard the term before this conversation. Jessica's mother later explains to me that there's no such thing as a white woman who is molleta. With this language, Amber is differentiating herself from her friend. With Jessica and me, Amber is outspoken with her opinions about racialized difference and open about the logics behind her opinions. She states assuredly, quote, "There are women that can plant to harvest, drive a crane, that are a race that is strong and rough. The others are women who are una raza empresarial, or translated as an entrepreneurial or business class." She says, they don't know how to cook dinner. They only know their mathematics or physics. There are many kinds of women. Her logic reveals a racial bias that perhaps confirms her own trajectory in getting a business degree. She says, quote, "There are women who are Dominican and they don't have the same strength or structure of their body. I think that Jessica is stronger than I am," she tells me. Her delineation between herself and Jessica points to their difference in color and perhaps other aspects of their phenotype, even as the two women are around the same age and same size. "I know," says Jessica emphatically, "it becomes clear that being a female in a race apart that is stronger and tougher, fuerte y áspera, as Amber describes it, is in no way a compliment. Amber's description undermines the femininity that Jessica works daily to produce through her femme and sexually provocative clothing and trips to the salon to straighten her hair and polish her nails." And so that's the kind of ethnographic work that I try to do and show with as much space for the language of the people that I am writing about, and also my own, strengths and limitations in translation of the text, just to show the ways that the power dynamic plays out, but that how much this construction of identity is relational, and that it's always being built in and within these conversations, but that sort of doing these interviews definitely led me into conversations where I experienced some discomfort around what was being shared because of my own ideas about race and racism. And then, I just had to read in terms of representation and body language and with the language and tools that I had in order to talk about Dominican women. And again, like, these were younger folks, so they had a lot of the narratives, but they hadn't unpacked it as much as some of my interviews with folks maybe later in their 20s that had more experience with and challenged and unpacked, especially some of the queer activist folks that I talked with that had critiqued and challenged gender constructions quite a bit more. But I was learning in the moment of how to navigate these things with this first book project. And the last slide I wanted to share is actually where the book ends up, which is around like the thing that I avoided in the project. Looking at visual and popular culture, I really ended up kind of waiting until the end to address the undergirding violence against women. That's always there and always present, and always something that Dominican women are living with in a context where their bodies are seen as part of the thing that can be consumed in the context of the Caribbean as a colonized space, a neoliberal space, and a space where people are continuing to engage in a tourism that relies on the consumption of Black and Brown women's bodies, and also trans bodies, also men and boys' bodies, but in different range. So this is an image of one of the many protests of the movement now that is both resisting anti-abortion laws that have been built in the Constitution that make it so that no abortion for any reason, that leaves it so that the state is really deciding on the lives of young women who might be dealing with pregnancy, like in the case of Esperanza, but then cannot get care for cancer. So there's a way that the disposability is structural. And yet there's quite a bit of activism in resistance to the state. And now it's been, I think, a decade of activism. And when I was back there in August, this ongoing protest to resist. And it's certainly in that activism, there's much that we can learn in the US about how to fight for the rights of most vulnerable identities in our communities. But what in my work in cultural studies, I was also interested in kind of theorizing how ambiguity of identity might contribute to the challenge of being able to protect Dominican women and girls, because in the ways that race might be ambiguous, there's also a lot of ambiguity around whether once pregnant, then the story we tell is about a young mother and how she must be protected versus how adolescent girls are seen as disposable in other ways before they're understood as a potentiality of being a mother. So there's like slippages in language and representation that are important to unpack in this work, because it has to do with how we value and think about people in this context, right? And that the stories that we bring shape how the looking and our engagement and the rights that we offer. And so, I have the privilege of moving in and out of that space, but I also, and I have the privilege of offering this critique to a broader audience. But I'm very committed to the ongoing conversation with activists, elevating the work that they do, within these structures that remain very tied to the United States. And so that is some of the work that I was able to accomplish with this first book, and as a sort of experiment and exploration. But it's been really exciting to see that there are already a lot of scholars in Dominican studies and junior Dominican scholars coming up who want to write about the contemporary context of the Dominican Republic. And I'm hoping that this book will offer them some foundation or things to work with, and also inspire them to really pay attention to popular culture versus, in this field, there's been a lot of focus on the history that has been produced by a narrower group of people. And so we're like at an exciting moment to see where this next wave of Dominican studies scholarship might take us. So glad to be part of the conversation. I'm looking forward to questions this audience might have. Again, thanks for inviting me to talk about my work. And I'll stop.